Want to hear me? Do you hear me? Anyone?
Yes, hi. The show starts
Hi.
at 10:30. I think we have 2 minutes. Sorry for the...
אוקיי, בסדר. אבל שומעים אותי, כן?
כן, כן, מצוין, שומעים אותך.
אוקיי, בסדר. אמ, ואני יכול לשתף
אני
את
אעשה
הדף
אותך,
מקורות?
פוסט. כן,
פשוט
כן,
שיהיה לי את
מצוין.
האפשרות אני רוצה כלומר, גם... בסדר, אני יכול?
כבר I'm making your host, one second.
אוקיי, בסדר.
לא יודעת מה הייתה הבעיה בלהכניס אנשים, גם עכשיו אני נתקעתי. participants, רגע. make a host. תראה אם עכשיו אתה יכול.
שנייה. לא. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
לא?
רשום פה כשאני מנסה. Host disabled participant screen sharing. אביעד. אוקיי, עכשיו. אז אם את יכולה לאשר לי, אז... או להפוך אותי לאחד מהמערכים.
כן, כן, עשיתי.
שנייה. זה עוד לא נקלט. לא. לא.
לא עובד?
את צריכה להפוך אותי להיות
אני
מארח.
יודעת, עשיתי. עכשיו אני אעשה הוסט, זה לא קו-הוסט. אני מקווה שזה לא על חשבוני כדי שאני אוכל להמשיך להכניס אנשים. יש?
לא, אין עדיין. גם לא
למה
ראיתי
התמונה שלך
שהפכתי...
נעלמה? סגרת את המצלמה? איזה מוזר.
לא.
פתאום אני לא רואה
זה מאוד
אותך.
מוזר בגלל שיש לי... מה, את שומעת אותי,
כן, כן.
אז בסדר, אז יש לי אינטרנט.
Yeah.
אביעד טבורי is the host. זה שרשום לי. אולי הוא צריך לרדת, אני לא יודע. Hi everyone. We're experiencing some technical difficulties.
הצליח לך? עכשיו אני רואה אותך שוב.
אוקיי. כן, אבל אני לא...
מקסימום אני אשתף את הדף מקורות כמו שעשיתי בשיעור הראשון, אבל ברור שזה פחות מומלץ.
עכשיו אני יכול לתת. בסדר, אין בעיה. רואים?
תכף
אוקיי,
נראה.
מצוין.
תודה.
אני רואה את זה. אני גם יכול להכניס. איזה כוח.
מעולה, תעזור לי.
יש. היא בצ'אט. אוקיי. טוב.
Please, everyone, put yourselves on mute, or yeah, mute yourselves, or I'll mute you and I'll open Rabbi Susman. Maybe that's better.
Okay. Okay. בסדר, רק שנייה. So, okay. Does everyone...
לא, עכשיו תפתח את שלך. השתקתי את כולם, תפתח את שלך.
Okay.
יופי. Thank you.
Second. Okay. Okay. So, okay. Okay, so I have I don't really see most people on the screen because of the share screen. But can everyone see the Daf B'Korot clearly? Should I make it larger?
Can't see it yet.
Please make it larger.
Okay, I'll make it right now. It's at 150%. That better for everyone?
It didn't really change.
Okay, I try to make it as big as possible while it stays on the screen. Okay. In my computer, it's at 200%, which is a little bit too large. So we'll just make it 190%, which holds everything. Does everyone see that now? I hope. Okay. So it's, I guess since I've minimized all of the screens, I guess it's good not to see all of you. I hope that everyone is weathering the war as well as possible, and of course we'll begin our the shiur with tefillot for all of the suim from all of the attacks, and especially from this morning, and Bezrat Hashem hatzlacha for the continuation of the operation. So I'm going to speak about something totally unconnected, something from this week's Parsha. I mentioned last week that over the course of these shurim, that I want to talk about different aspects of authority, if you will, in halacha, things that come up in the various parshiot. And so today, talking about something which actually I spoke about here 6 years ago, for those of you who remember it. It's a different, it's related, but there are new makorot here and different perspectives on it. The question of the penal system in halacha, and specifically the question of prison, and whether that's something which is if you will, a Jewish thing at all. Now, the Torah in our Parsha, at the very end of the Parsha in Shvi'i, the Torah talks about the case of the Mikoshesh Etzim, the person who was gathering wood on Shabbat. Here in the first source, Vayu b'nei Yisrael b'midbar v'yimtzeu Mikoshesh Etzim b'yom HaShabbat. So the people who found him will say, the witnesses, so they 1 second, I think I'm only on read only. That's not good. They saw they bring him to Moshe. This is Pasuk Lamed Daled, and I'll try to highlight it. Though I think I might be only on. It's not allowing me to change it. So let me see if I can fix that. The Vayanichu oto b'mishmar, and so they put him under watch. Kilo forash mala asot, because it had not been the vaya asolo. So it had not been explained. The idea Rashi explains below porash meyaseh here in number 2. So it was understood, the Torah already told us back in Parshat Kitisa, so whoever defiles the Shabbat is chayav mita, but the Torah hadn't told us which of these mita. So he's put into under watch. He's put in a detention and waiting for Hashem to explain what should be done. And indeed, in Pasuk Lamed Hey, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, Mot yumat ha'ish ragol moto ba'avanim kol ha'eda michutz lamachane. So the Torah tells us that that he should indeed be that he should be in Bechalel Shabbat, that he should be stoned, and that is the punishment. So here you have an example, one of several in the Torah, of a situation where people are put under detention. I'll just come down to the table here, and this is not all of the instances in Tanakh. For example, what I didn't bring here, all of the instances where Yirmiyahu, for example, is put into the bore, and he's so he's imprisoned. But the 4 that I want to focus on here in the Torah, and I'll come to a 5th in Sefer Ezra in a moment, is here what we see here. Also, the back in Vayikra Chavdalid, number 4 on the here on the table. Vayanichuhu b'mishmar lifrosh lahem al pi Hashem. So he was placed. This is referring to the person who was Mikalel Hashem. This is the person who cursed the God, and he's placed in also in detention. The same term, mishmar, to wait for instruction. There, that instruction is a little different, because there it's not clear what the penalty, not only that it's already a death penalty, but rather it's a question of should he be punished at all, and what punishment should be given to him. So but again, you have this detention. Number 5 is what we read in last week's parsha. Vayan Yoshua ben Nun misharet Moshe b'churav vayomar Adoni Moshe klaem. Number 5 here. I apologize, for some reason I'm unable to highlight. I don't know why that my computer is not allowing me to highlight. I guess Larry points out that Mishmar was Thursday night in high school. Now you know why people felt under detention. But be that as it may, so here Yehoshua, this is referring to Eldad and Medad, that Moshe says, Yehoshua says to Moshe, these people are prophesizing without a license in the camp, and they should be klaem, and it's not totally clear what klaem means, but our modern Hebrew as well. Kela is a term used for incarceration. They should be locked up. The Ramban on that parsha, so he explains what does it mean, klaem. This is here number 3. Just looking at in the bold print, lekach amar lo klaem ki ulai ruach sheker b'fihem or ruach ra miva'atam. Perhaps they're lying. It's a false prophecy. Perhaps there's some evil. There's some evil that is going to befall us because of what they're saying. Hinei tzrichin l'sumam so we should put them into jail as though he were a crazy person, as though who is and they're prophesying, right? It's basically what you see from the Ramban is that right now we have two different kinds of incarceration that the Torah is talking about. The first one, which in our Parsha and in Vayikra, are basically people who've committed crimes. Their punishment is not going to be the incarceration. No, it's important to note that the prison is not being used as a penal system. It is a detention as we await what should be done. When it comes to what Yehoshua is recommending for Moshe, and of course Moshe rejects the idea, and he says, "Mi yited," right? Would it be that all the people would have this kind of nivuah? But I know, are you truly jealous for me? It's okay. Let everyone do that. But be that as it may, what Yehoshua does it, at least according to the Ramban, is not trying to say, oh, Eldad and Medad have prophesied without a license. Okay, and therefore that's a violation of the criminal code, and their punishment is jail. But rather, they are a public menace, and they need to be detained so that we can limit whatever damage they're going to do. You can also get an idea of what perhaps prison is being used for, at least one of the uses, in the time of the Ramban. The Ramban is living in the 13th century in Spain. And he's coming, and basically you see that the prison system is not primarily a penal system. That's a much more modern kind of understanding of the penal system in general. It's being used for the detaining of dangerous persons while their proceedings are being processed, and to sort of the lines with ki'ish mishuga. Okay, you have asylums which are being used to hold people who are considered to be mentally unfit, and that's the purpose of the prisons. The prison itself, the expectation that they're going to be sentenced to X number of years, that's still several centuries away. We have similar ideas here in Tanakh, because back in Parshat back in Sefer Bereshit, we have Yosef, for example. First of all, himself being placed in the Beit HaSohar, Mekom Asher Asirei HaMelech Asurim. So where the prisoners of the king are detained. Now, Vahisha Bebeit HaSohar. Now, is that he's been sentenced to life? Remember, he's going to be in that jail for about 13 years. We don't know exactly how long. We just know that he is taken out of the jail at the age of 30, and he comes to Egypt at the age of 17. So we don't know how long Yosef was in the house of Potiphar before he was actually put into the Beit HaSohar, but we'll say roughly a decade. Okay, that's how long he's there. Is he there as a punishment crime, or is it that he's just basically been? We have a person who maybe Potiphar has totally forgotten about him, throwing him in, and now he's stuck in that jail, because you could see from the other two people who we meet in the prison, the Sar HaOfim and the Sar Tabachim, the Sar Mashke, excuse me, the butler and the baker. So they are going to beat their sentencing, if you will. That's what their dreams are all about. So they are in a holding cell. That's basically what's going on. The holding cell might be for months, it might be for years, but they're in a holding cell, and and Yosef seems to be working in the prison. Right? That's what he's become, the servant of the Sar Beit HaSohar. So there too, the Beit HaSohar itself is not a penal system, but rather it seems to be a holding system. And we see that clearly in Perek Membet, where Yosef, once he is now the ruler and he has to deal with his brothers, so he puts Shimon into a holding pattern as well, waiting for the brothers to come back from Canaan. So it's not a punishment to Shimon, but rather it is a means to make sure that the brothers are going to return with Binyamin. There is one exception, and by the way, one last word here when we're talking about Tanakh. I mentioned Yirmiyahu before. It seems to be that that's what that's what Tzidkiyahu, the king, is doing to Yirmiyahu as well. The idea is not to punish Yirmiyahu, but rather to detain him and not allow him to basically to raise discontent amongst the people, or scare them with his nevuot zam, with his prophecies of destruction. There is one exception, and the different scholars, great scholars, Gershon Alon on the one hand, and Menachem Elon, the late justice to the Supreme Court. So they argue about the meaning of this particular psukim in Ezra, because the here you have it, because of the Aramaic. I just also put it in the English, that Ezra is given the license from the king Artaxerxes to judge. And I'll just look at the English. Ezra, after the wisdom of your God, who is in your hand, appoint magistrates and judges who may judge all the people who are beyond the river. In other words, here, there, the king is on the eastern side of the Euphrates, and so it's now referring to the western side of the Euphrates here in Eretz Israel. And all such as know the laws of your God, and teach him who doesn't know them. Whoever will not do the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be executed on him with all diligence, whether it to be death, banishment, or to confiscation of goods, or to imprisonment. Okay, so, and if you take a look at the Hebrew or the Aramaic, the last line, it says, la'anosh nichsin v'le'esurin, to punish through confiscation, villa esurin. So the argument between Gershon Alon and Justice Elon is to whether that punishment is referring to the imprisonment as well, or is the punishment that's being referred to only with regard to confiscation of property. Le'esurin means that one of the powers of a magistrate is to detain people while they're being held in trial. But it's not that is the punishment. Gershon Alon is of the first opinion that this is actually an indication that there was punishment. Justice Elon disagrees and says that there is no evidence at all of any punishment in general, not only in Jewish circles, but in the ancient world, as prison being used as punishment. I'll just skip the Rav Hirsch for just one moment, go to number 10 here. He quotes, actually, in this context, not with regard to understand the psukim, but he mentions this. There's one of the most important Roman jurists, a fellow by the name of Ulpian. What I found interesting when I looked him up was that he is living at the same time as the Mishnah and as Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He's also born very close. He's born in Lebanon, and there's a Jewish community there. There's a good chance that he has dealings with Jewish jurists as well, not only the Roman jurists. But anyway, his one of his more famous quotations, apparently, I'll just read the English, not the Latin. For prisons should be used to contain people, not to punish them. In other words, so it could be indicative that there are those people who are trying to use prisons as punishment, and he's trying to say, no, that's not proper legal practice. Proper legal practice is to be using it as a detention area, but not as a punishment in of itself. Excuse me. But be that as it may, it reflects what seems to be going on in the halachic system of the time, and we're going to see where that begins to change in a moment. Now to go back to what Rav Hirsch says on his commentary in general, the beginning of Parshat Mishpatim, he has a lengthy piece on with regard to the nature of the legal system, and in there he mentions the following. And I apologize, I didn't have the English, and I should have just had ChatGPT translate this. But anyway, I apologize. Just reading the Hebrew. Odshei ma'asar al kol hatikva v'ashchatat hamusar hashochnim acharei chomot beit hakela. In other words, Rav Shimshon Hirsch is writing now in the mid-19th century, and he's describing his understanding of the Torah legal system, obviously through the prism of what he is experiencing. Now, in the mid-19th century, that is the heyday of when what we would understand as the modern penitentiary system, that's when it's really being developed throughout Europe and we'll say in the United States as well. And when he's writing this, for example, those people from America would be familiar with. So this is when Sing Sing prison, which is considered to be the technological model of the day, is being built in the 1850s. So here, Onshea ba'asar al kol hatikvot v'ashchatat hamusar shochnim achrei chomot beit hakela al kol hayagon va'anacha shehem meviim al ishto va'al tapo shel ha'asir ein lahem makom b'torat ha'el. So he says that from our perspective, this so-called modern penitentiary system, which is being considered and being developed as being an advance, because throughout the medieval period and the early modern period, so corporal punishment is very, and not only corporal, capital punishment, even for things along the lines of petty theft. So in the first half of the 19th century, so in London, there are daily hangings for people who are caught stealing. So and now the reform is the penitentiary system. So he says that from our perspective, it's not a reform at all, but it's a step back because of the and this is a discussion beyond the scope of this shir today, but is basically to this very day, is the penitentiary system a system which is effective in reforming convicts, or is it more just basically a breeding ground for more crime? And when people are released, so they've learned a violent kind of existence in the prisons. And this is, and of course, it also affects innocent people. So you have the family who's now not going to be able to find easy means of support while the main breadwinner is locked up. So he just says that this is a terrible, terrible system, and the Torah has nothing to do with it. Just to skip one line to the next place where it is in bold, and again, I apologize that I can't highlight it. I don't know what's wrong with my computer here. B'mishpat haTorah ein ela ma'atzar v'chakira. So when it comes to the Torah, we use this along the lines of what Ulpian had said, that it is a form of administrative detention that we are able to use as a while the proceedings are going on. Now, in halacha, this is actually limited as well. The Yerushalmi has a piece here. The Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin is part of a larger sugya. I'm just taking the snippet which has the relevance to us. Rabbi Yirmiyah b'shem Rabbi Shmuel b'Rabbi Yitzchak zot ameret kedanin mi safek pe'ech avida. So with forgetting about what he's referring to, he says, if I can deduce from the previous statement, which I have not brought here, that you can have legal proceedings when there is a doubt, meaning when we don't know exactly whether there is even evidence against the person. And so that is, so how could that be? Hey Chavida, Ploni haraget hanefesh yenidon ad shiavo edav. So if there is a rumor that that someone killed another person, so he can be judged until he ad shiavo edav, until until witnesses come. Amarle Rabbi Yossi. In other words, there are no witnesses that there are no witnesses here. But 1 second, hold on. I just lost the screen share. Hold on. There we go. So there are witnesses, but there are no witnesses. So but there is we'll say, some rumor going about that this person is guilty of murder. So you can begin the proceedings and hold him in a holding cell while you go through the proceedings. So Amarle Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi responds to Rabbi Yirmiyah. V'tafshin barnasha b'shuka v'vazile. What? Just because there is a concern that this person's a murderer, remember, how can you possibly just grab him in the public marketplace and embarrass him? Elakeni plone haraget hanefesh v'harei edav sharaget hanefesh yetafus ad shiavo edav. So but rather, this is the way it has to be understood, that there is what we would say is that there is strong evidence that the person is guilty of the crime. In other words, not only is there a rumor to the effect that this person is a murderer, but that we know who the witnesses are, but they just haven't arrived in court. So while we're waiting for the witnesses to arrive, we can hold the person. Now, this is very similar to a modern understanding of the use of detention. In other words, you have to have at least a reasonable case. The police have to build a reasonable case against the accused before they can detain the person. Now, there are going to be exceptions, as we're all familiar with from the modern law, and the question is whether the halacha would accept it. But it sounds from the Yerushalmi that it's a very we would say very liberal type of reading of the person's rights, that until you have this kind of until you have knowledge of who the witnesses are, you can't detain a person unnecessarily. In the cases that we have, right, in terms of the Torah, let's say the 3 cases that we talked about detention, the Mikoshesh Etzim in our Parsha, the case of the Mikalel, the case of Eldad and Medad, in all 3 instances, the actual event is already documented. There are witnesses to it. The question is, okay, now that we know, we have to figure out what to do. So the Yerushalmi is working along those lines. The Ran, by the way, here in number 13, I'm going to skip the explanation of the Pnei Moshe, which is more or less the way that I explained it until now on the Yerushalmi. The Ran is living in the 14th century, beginning of the 14th century in Barcelona, and he says it he's even more progressive, if you will, more liberal in this reading. He says, Nira mitocha Yerushalmi, shemekevan shebo edin v'amru lifnei beitin ploni gadaf, afa pi shelo kiblu edotam chofshinotam. Aval im lo ba'u ha'edim lefanenu, eino bedin lechofsho levazato chinam. So he doesn't even say what we said a moment ago. We explained the Yerushalmi is that there is a report of specific witnesses, and now they just haven't arrived in court yet, so we can't do anything about it. Excuse me, but that's sufficient, according to the Yerushalmi, to take the person off the street and detain him, because we know who the witnesses are. And now it could be the witnesses are going to come, and they're not going to their testimony will not bear out what we suspect. But at least we know who the witnesses are. The Ran is going one step further. He's saying, no, the witnesses have to actually have come to court. The witnesses have to be at the police station. So if the witnesses are in the police station, so then you can detain a person. Just the knowledge or the assumption that we have evidence against this person, that's insufficient according to the Ran. So according to this, the use of prison, even as detention, and certainly not as penalty, so that's something which is very strongly, seems to be in the halachic system at least, we give a great deal of protection to the accused before we will go and just take him off the street. There is, on the other hand, a discussion of a form of prison that's being used already in the time of the Mishnah for what seems to be for the penalty itself. And here is the case. The Mishalaka, number 14. Mishalaka vishana vishana. So if you have a person who has been convicted of a crime, and that person has received the punishment of lashes, vishana, and he repeats the crime, Beit Din machnisin oto lekipa umachilin oso saorin ad shekreso mitbakat. So this is something which other sources add to, that he has to, or it has to be a 3 strikes you're out type of situation. Now all we can do is lash the person. We can't do anything else. So what we do is we detain the person. We create the means where he will basically it's pretty gruesome by our standards, that we feed him barley with water, and that causes bloating to the point where he will eventually die from the malady. Similarly, we have horeget the nefesh shelo be'edim maknisin oto lekipa umachilin oto lechem tsar umayim lachatz. So here we have a situation where if a person has been killed, has murdered someone, but the Gemara talks about this in terms of that, or the Tosefta, that you have a situation where it's overwhelming circumstantial evidence that the person is guilty of the crime, but we just don't have witnesses to it, so we can't execute the person, but we know that he's guilty. So what do? We detain him, and here it sounds as though that we don't. It's a life sentence. We feed him a minimal amount of bread as well as a minimal amount of water. So we have to keep him alive, but we don't have to. But for how long is he going to be there? That's not totally clear. So this is so here we have what seems to be used as a means of punishment, and that could be the way that it's understood. The Rambam, remember, the Rambam is living now in the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century. So the Rambam has familiarity with medieval prisons. So he talks about the following: Kippah, what's number 15 here? The first line, which is highlighted, Kippah matbah. So this is the term, the Arabic term, Osin Otov Batei Sohar. So it's basically what we would call a cell, where solitary cell, but it's kind of it's kind of harsh. Yesh begovo kikomat adam bilvad ve'ein lo bo efo lishkav velo lishan. So basically, it's a closet where you put the person, and he's there isn't enough room for him to sit or to lie down to sleep. In other words, he's in a very, very uncomfortable situation. So the Rambam combines the two explanations of the Gemara of the Mishnah, and the last line of the Rambam says, "Kol ha'ra'ui l'kippah notnim lo lechem tsar u'mayim lachatz." Anyone who is getting this prison, so we're going to give him that minimal ration that we were talking about before, ad she'yachlashu kochotav, until his strength is weakened. In other words, we reach a point where the person is physically unfit, and then we push him over the edge, as it were, with the kind of rations that will make his health deteriorate even further, and he will eventually die of that. So so where does this come from? I mean, we all are familiar with the halacha, but basically that you need two witnesses, and the person has to be warned beforehand, and then nevertheless commit the crime in full knowledge of what he's doing. Where does this idea that basically we have overwhelming circumstantial evidence that the person is guilty of the crime, but still, what gives us the right to do this? After all, as we saw in Rav Hirsch, we don't believe in prison, but also we don't believe in punishing people without due process, and the due process of the halacha doesn't allow for that person to be punished. So how can this be? So here, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, number 16 here, the Gemara quotes a general principle. Tanya Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Ober, Shamati shebeitin makin va'onshin shelo min haTorah, v'lo la'avor al divrei Torah l'kedei la'asot siyag l'Torah. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, and this is a braita dating to the 2nd century. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is saying, Shamati, I have this Masorah. This is the tradition that you can punish people even though it is extra legal. And this isn't considered a violation of the Torah, but rather this is making a siyag l'Torah. This allows us to protect the Torah. And then the Gemara or the Braita gives two examples. I'll just take the first one. U'ma'aseh be'echad sherachav al sus b'Shabbat b'mei Yevanim. So there was an instance where a person rode his horse during the Hellenistic period, ve'heviu lebeitin, and they brought him to Beitin for riding his horse on Shabbat, which is only an Isur D'Rabbanan, Bisaklu, and they executed him with stoning. Lo mipnei shera'ui lekach, not because that this is the actual sentence. After all, it's a rabbinic violation, and he shouldn't be executed for this. Ela shashat tzricha lekach. But rather, the assumption was that the Beitin of the time decided that people were being lax with regard to Shvirat Shabbat, and here was a person who was flagrantly violating the Shabbat by riding his horse in public, and so Beitin decided that this is something that needed to be addressed, and they addressed it quite harshly, with the assumption that this would have an impact on the community at large. And that, the Gemara says, the Braita says, is within the rights of the Beitin. The Rambam expanding on this, the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, here number 17, so the first he quotes the idea well, we'll just read the whole Rambam. Halacha daled kol elu aratzchanim uchiyotze bahen. If you have murderers and those people like murderers, michuyavim mitat beitin. So they she'enan mechuyavim beitin. They're not punishable by the rules of beitin. Im ratzam melech Yisrael lahargam bedin hamalchut b'takanat haolam reshut biyado. So the Rambam introduces the king. In other words, he introduces the authorities, the executive power, that the executive power is able to judge this person and execute the person as well, if the public order demands it. Similarly, if Beit Din wants to do it for a specific specific instance, if there is a need, in other words, Beit Din has the ability. This is the Gemara that we just read before. Has the in a specific limited capacity. We're not changing the legal code. We're simply saying that that this requires something which is extraordinary circumstances to require extraordinary measures. So this person is going to be found guilty by the Beit Din, and they too have the right to do a yesh l'reshut kafi mashi yiru. They don't have to execute the person. They can decide to do other forms of punishment, whatever Beit Din sees fit. Harei shelargam hamelech v'lo hayta sha'at tzricha lechazek hadavar Beit Din chayavin mikol makom lahakotam makar rabah krova lemi'ita la'asor tov b'matzor v'matzog shanim rabot u'litza'aran b'chol minei tzar. So here the Rambam is using the prison as the penalty. So it's here, the Rambam says, what can Beit Din do? Beit Din can, and this is really, and this is something that that Justice Elon in his article, we're going to see a quote from him in a moment, wants to make the argument that when it comes to the use of these, if we will, non-halachic methods of punishment. So the chachamim of any given generation are looking around them in the societies that they live in, are using the kind of penalties that exist in the, if you will, in the general penal system. So here you see it nicely in the Rambam, right? Rambam is living in the Middle Ages, and what the Rambam is saying is that, okay, you have, what can you do? So you can administer corporal punishment, and you can also put them into a dungeon for a shanim rabot, right, for many years. Now it's basically lock them up, throw away the key, and in order to do what? Kidei lahafchid ulayem al shara risha'im. So in order to threaten and to deter other evildoers, that they won't do the same thing and they won't find themselves under similar circumstances. So I'll just mention before I get to the Ran, this is something which he mentioned a book as the source, and I didn't have a chance to see the actual article. The claim is that Jewish prisons, compared to, because the Jews had had autonomy in terms of judging other Jews in many communities throughout the medieval period and into the early modern period, really up until the emancipation. And part of emancipation was that Jewish courts became subservient to the general courts of the land. And that's what happens here in Israel as well. The rabbinic court system is a parallel court system, but it is under the authority of the general legal system, the general court system. But as long as Jews had autonomy and they were they were punishing their own criminals, so the prisons and that the Jewish community ran, and some of these prisons are still extant, and you can see them in trips to Europe, that the conditions were generally much better than the non-Jewish prisons. Or is that the idea that what we think of in terms of dungeons of the Inquisition and the like. Even you can go in certain places in Europe. They even have museums of torture. That's it's pretty gruesome. I've never gone in. I think it's sort of a little bit too dark for my taste. But you can see the instruments of torture that were being used in these medieval prisons, these terrible torture devices, and those were absent from Jewish prisons. We'll see an exception in a moment as we go on. But before we have another 10 minutes or so, I might go a couple of minutes over because we started a little bit late. But the Ran, as we spoke about the Ran before, in Barcelona in the 14th century, and the Ran in one of his drashot establishes a very, very important principle. He basically, I'm not going to read it all inside because of the time, but it's one of these pieces of that I consider to be a literacy piece. In other words, it is hugely important for educated Torah Jew to be aware of this piece of the Ran. The Ran basically asks the question that many of us have asked at one point or another when we think about the Jewish legal system. And the Jewish legal system, the Ran points out, and I'm not saying anything that you probably haven't thought of yourselves, doesn't work. How are you supposed to expect to stop murder in the streets if you have to have two witnesses who warn the criminal before the crime is committed that don't kill that person, and if you do, you're going to be executed by the court, and we're watching you. And he says, I'm going to do it anyway, and he kills the person. How often is that going to happen? There wouldn't be much, there are a lot of series that people binge watch that there wouldn't be much to watch if that's what criminal systems were all about. Okay, because how many crimes are going to be committed, and how hard is it going to be to solve the crime? Law and Order would not really go very far past the first 5 minutes of the first episode. So what are you going to do with it? Right? So how could that possibly be? And the Ran in this piece here, so he basically says that and I'm just going to read the middle 3 lines where it's underlined. Shoftim v'Sanhedrin hayat tachlitam lishpot ha'am b'mishpat emet אמיתית צודק בעצמו שימשך ממנו הדבק עניין האלוקי בנו. The Ran basically says the following, when we keep Shabbat, when we keep Kashrut, when we talk about Lashon Hara, so what are we doing? We are engaged not in a legal system, we're engaged in an educational system. We are trying to create a society that there is no crime because people, not because they're afraid of punishment, but because they are of a moral fiber which is superior. And he says, don't think for a moment that our Sanhedrin system, our legal system, isn't part of that same fabric. In other words, everything that we do, whether it is keeping kosher, whether it's learning Torah, whether it's keeping Shabbat, whether it's being in the Sanhedrin, is all part of what he calls hadbek inyan ha'eloki banu, in order to make us spiritually advanced human beings. That is the purpose of the Torah as a whole. And our Sanhedrin and our Edut system and everything that we learned in Masechet Sanhedrin, everything we learned in Masechet Makot, everything that we learned in Nizikin, all of that is incorporated into this grand educational system that we call Torah. That is, and it's as true of Sanhedrin as it is of, I don't know, Hilchot Tuma v'Tahara. All of it is part and parcel of the same grand system. And the Torah recognizes, halacha recognizes that that's an ideal. That is not necessarily something that can be expected to hold out in every single society and under every single circumstance. And the Torah, as a result, created the executive power of the Melech. The king has the right, what we read before in the Rambam, it's not just simply saying, oh, things are breaking down, so therefore the Melech steps in to establish martial law under these circumstances. What it's saying is that the system itself recognizes that there are going to be times that the system can't handle the type of crimes that we're familiar with. And under those circumstances, if the educational system is incomplete, so then we have, as part of the system, it's not extra legal, it is part of the legal system for the king to step in and establish martial law, if you will, under those circumstances. One might argue that it is still something which is a b'di'evet. It's not a desired result, but it's something which is perhaps a necessary result. He says, by the way, that this is his understanding. It's really a beautiful explanation of why when Shmuel was so disappointed with Bnei Yisrael for wanting a king, even though the Torah seems to say that you have the right and the ability to choose a king. So if you read the two Parshiot, the Parshat Shoftim, as opposed to the Sefer Shmuel, the difference between what the people ask for as opposed to what they ask for in the Torah, there's one word that's different. It says, right, Siba Aleinu Melech, give us a king in both places. So Kechola Goyim, like all of the nations, both places. The difference is in Shmuel, they add a word, Siba Aleinu Melech lishoftenu, to judge us. In other words, what the argument of the Ran is that the people of that generation didn't want to be troubled with the educational system. They wanted to have simply a normal legal system, the way every other country has, and deal with the crime. And the king will deal with the crime the way that the king deals with the crime in every other society. And they gave up the educational side. They wanted to give up what the Torah was all about. So under those circumstances, that's bad. And that's something that Shmuel was very disappointed with them and castigated them for. But the combination of the educational with the executive power, that's something which exists. And the Ran says, when you don't have a king, if you don't have a executive power, so then you have the Sanhedrin who steps in for that. With the Sanhedrin acting and basically as the authority of the state, that's what all of these sugyot are all about. And the system that you choose is going to basically be the system which is the system that you're familiar with. So the Ran and the Rambam and all the medievalists will look at prison, better get back to our initial discussion, we'll look at prison as being one of the tools that the courts have to deal with crime, and it's not the major. It's not the major tool. Major tool is going to be various forms of capital and corporal punishment, which the medievalists were so fond of. But but prison is one of those tools. As society moves, we'll say, forward, or moves, because I don't know what Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch would say about that term that I said, moves forward. As society goes on, so then prison becomes if you will, the means of choice being used within the context of the power of the state, the power of the melech, the power of the courts, to make sure that there is a civil order and the necessary steps are taken to do that. And I'm just going to, because we're running out of time, so I'm just going to show two different cases, one from the medieval period, a little bit later than what we were talking about before. The Rav Shimon ben Tzemach Duran, one of the great poskim of the later period of the Rishonim, the end of the 14th, beginning of the 15th century. He was born in Majorca, in the riots of 1391. 100 years before the expulsion of Spain, so was the first major wave of anti-Jewish pogroms and forced conversions. So his family, or he himself actually, was already 30 years old. He moved from Spain to Algeria, and that's where he became renowned as a Gadol Hador. So there he had the following. He said the following question. The case was someone who was blind, Ruvain Sagi Nahor, and he had some jewels that he had held, and he was with another person, and lo and behold, the jewels disappeared, and he accused the person that he was with, and the person was a known felon, that he had stolen his pearls, and he takes him to court. And the question was, there are no witnesses to this. There's strong suspicion on the part of the court that the accused is indeed guilty. What means can be used? And the question is sent to the Tashbetz, and his response is that they have the full authority, along the lines of what we saw until now, full authority to deal with it without witnesses and etc., based on circumstantial evidence for the reasons that we said. And he says in the second to last line here, which I underline, Tvar asarti ani bebeit hasohar Yehudi mikan ta'an alav oreach nafusi, a fellow that's a local Jew that a guest from the town of Nafus. That's Sheganav Mamash Val Yidei Nochrin Divrei Hamet. So we had a case, and it was established based on non-Jewish testimony that this person was indeed the thief. And what was the impression that I did? Asartiv, right? In other words, I locked him up. That was the punishment that I chose. So you see here that he's using imprisonment as the punishment, and he's saying that the reason why I have the right to do it is for the Gemarot that and he doesn't put around, but the sources that we quoted before. Similarly, the son of the Rush. Here, number 20, I'm not going to read it, but he basically, this is along the lines of what we spoke about last week when we were talking about the situation in Spain with regard to the piece from the Akedat Yitzchak. So he's in a different area of Spain, a little bit earlier than the Akedat Yitzchak, but he has to deal with people who are having sexual relations with the non-Jewish, their non-Jewish neighbors. In this case, it's a Moorish woman, a Muslim woman, as opposed to the Avodot Elilim, the Christian women. But he says the punishment of dealing with this person, and also the people who are perhaps covering up for that person, is prison. In the last, as I said, I would have, because we started late, getting to this last case. This is apparently in the 17th century into the beginning of the 18th century. So in Europe as a whole, those people, as well as colonial, you can, if you ever visit a place like Colonial Williamsburg in the United States, one of the first settlements in Virginia, they have this as well. And at the time, stocks, what we would call stocks, were becoming a popular means of imprisonment. People being not for necessarily days on end, but were being publicly shamed by being uh, uh, locked up in these what was called a kona, and this kona was common. I just took a quote from the article that I was looking at from Professor Elon, that this kona was and here I did translate it from ChatGPT, so you can look at it. That basically this was found, it was used, and we have it's still standing, if I'm not mistaken, in the Beit Din in Krakow. That they were used to punish people along the lines of what was popular in their surrounding Christian communities. In this context, and here you can take a look at what's really fascinating. We don't think of it this way. We're all familiar with the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, as being very strongly opposed to Hasidut. So apparently, the Gra employed this against early Hasidim. This is one of the tools in the toolbox of the Dayan, and the Gra, being not the official Rav of Vilna, but certainly the leading authority of his day, wanting to squelch Hasidut, so he put people into stocks as part of the punishment for joining the Hasidic movement. And what's interesting is that it is, compared to the same year, just looking at the English side here, in the same year we find in the Krakow community a court ruling issued against one Yisrael ben Aaron Velichker for a long list of wicked acts, robbery and violence against individuals to the public. And this is the same year. This is I think it's 1700, if I'm not mistaken. That this is the Gra is doing this, and the Gra wasn't born yet in 1700. I'm sorry. So we're talking about at the in the end of the second half of the 18th century. That's what he's referring to. But in the very same year that the Gra is doing it to Hasidim, so in Krakow, and if I'm not mistaken, the stocks that they used are still there. Where this kind of punishment was being meted out for, I guess, for today. I mean, I'll let everyone decide what you think is the greater offense: the robbery and violence against individuals in the public, or being a chassid. But the same punishment is being meted out by the Beit Din, and it's coming from the same idea. In other words, basically, the form of punishment, which is, if you will, not clearly delineated by the Torah, by the halacha, but is being used by the Beit Din, by the rules of Onshin Shalom Min Adin, which the Ran is saying is part of the system, part and parcel of the system. So that is really dependent upon the standards of the day. So today, if there were such a Beit Din, and I guess this is one instance where Beit Din has this right, today Beit Din is able to imprison people who refuse to give a get. And that's a punishment that they're giving, and so that's within the tools of the Beit Din. In other generations, so then they might have hired people to beat up the fellow who's refusing to give the get. And maybe that happens now and then today as well. But that is but you see from the fact that Beit Din has the legal right here in the state of Israel to imprison a misarev get, someone who refuses to give a get. So that's indicative that the same system is in place ad hayom. In other words, that basically whatever the standards of the society are for what's considered to be an appropriate form of punishment, Beit Din has the right to do it. It's not the ideal, but it is, if you will, the real. So looking forward to our next year being in person again. But that's I will now open up the screen for myself and anyone who has any questions or time. That's wish everyone a peaceful Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, that's very good.
Thank you. B'sara tova, Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shabbat Shalom. Good to
Shabbat
see you. Good to sort of see you.
Thank you.
All too.